Welcome to another episode of Iraq War 2003. Episode 7, Attempt at Nation Building. This is your host, Frank H. Wallis, Ph.D. And in this episode, I will attempt to very briefly summarize some of the key points of the attempts by Bush II to build a new nation in the country that he invaded and destroyed. Although ill-prepared for nation-building, Bush II and the U.S. government bungled into the enormous responsibility as another consequence of the capture of Iraq. The Coalition Provisional Authority, CPA, served as Bush II's conduit of empire. On May 6, 2003, Bush named L. Paul Bremer III as his envoy in Iraq, whose mission was to supervise nation-building. Bremer was to report to Bush II not directly, but through Rumsfeld and the Department of Defense. This nation-building was going to be a Pentagon operation. In fact, Rumsfeld designated Bremer as the administrator of the CPA, effectively becoming the proconsul or governor of Iraq. The U.S. Army paid most CPA salaries. Nearly 2,000 civilians in the Department of Defense were deployed to Southwest Asia in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom and the Global War on Terrorism, or GWAT. CPA employed a staff of 6,000 personnel at its peak. Bremer claimed to have the power of enacting laws through the signing of certain instruments, regulations, orders, memoranda, or public notices. These imperial instruments were issued in English and translated into Arabic only after going into effect. CPA, coalition forces, and the civilian personnel accompanying them were not subject to Iraqi law. They were subject only to the CPA and the laws of each nation which sent them. Even after putative sovereignty on June 28, 2004, when Bremer dissolved the CPA by his order, a strong American presence would remain. The U.S. Embassy in Baghdad was staffed with about 1,000 Americans and between 300 and 400 Iraqis for a total staff of up to 1,700, making it one of the top 3 U.S. embassies in the world. Annual budgets began at just under $1 billion. Contrast that with only 12 years before, in 1991, when the embassy had a staff of only 50 and a budget of $3.5 million. Zalmay Khalilzad, our old neocon favorite, replaced John Negroponte as ambassador in April 2005. The CPA had 3 tasks in its mission to absorb Iraq into the American empire: security, a pro-American government, and a free market economy. CPA Order Number 1 was on de-Ba'athification of Iraqi society. This abolished the Saddam Hussein regime. The CPA eliminated this decades-old Iraqi elite and tried to replace it with an Americanized elite. Bremer established the Iraqi De-Ba'athification Council, chaired by none other than Ahmed Chalabi. Bremer abolished the Iraqi military and security services and created a replacement more docile to American interests. With CPA Order Number 2, he named himself head of the new Iraqi army. A free news media was not tolerated. Bremer issued Order Number 14 to restrict freedom of press. Contractors and private security companies operating in Iraq on behalf of the CPA or foreign states were not bound by Iraqi law. The American occupation was free to use any Iraqi land it pleased for the establishment of camps, headquarters, or other facilities. The coalition was also granted the right to use water, electricity, and other utilities free of charge. The U.S. government was given an area within central Baghdad called the International Zone, or the Green Zone. Only 2 months after the declaration of Bush II that the Iraq invasion had been a success, Bremer issued Regulation Number 6 in July of 2003, establishing the first American collaborationist regime in Iraq. The same day, the Iraqi Governing Council, or IGC, was formed. This IGC and the CPA signed an agreement declaring that Iraq would regain independence on June 30th, 2004. Shiite Islam would be the official state religion and a source of all legislation, the same as Iran. Why 2004? Robin Raphael, the senior advisor to the Iraqi Ministry of Trade, said it was because Americans had no clue how to run Iraq. Quote, "It was very obvious to me that we couldn't do this. We could not run a country that we did not understand. We were a bunch of amateurs, largely, except for the engineers, and even they didn't have a professional means to interface with Iraqis. We couldn't possibly run their country for them. We figured that out by November, and that's why we set June as the date to return to sovereignty." Bush II's first choice for prime minister was former CIA operative Ayad Alawi. The shortage of imperial bureaucrats, along with an American lack of attention or patience with imperial rule, hampered the operations of the Iraqi proconsulate. Americans relied on Iraqis who claimed to wield power and influence in their local communities without verification, at face value, just as the British had done in the 1920s when they owned the country. Without a change of social regime, Iraqi elites would recolonize the economy and corruption would reign once again. But during the CPA regime, the largest buyers of Iraqi oil were, wait for it, Exxon-Mobil and Chevron-Texaco. All proceeds were supposed to be deposited into an Iraqi central fund managed by the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. Bush had already signed an executive order in May of 2003, completely shielding big oil companies from civil and criminal liability, even if they committed human rights violations, bribed officials, or caused environmental damage in the course of their Iraqi-related business. J.P. Morgan Chase was chosen, by some mysterious process, to lead a consortium of 13 international banks to finance the purchase of oil refining machinery. Even before the invasion, American and Iraqi elites began building the necessary connections between core and collaborator in the oil sector. In October of 2002, before the invasion, Cheney's staff had meetings with Ahmed Chalabi and officers of Exxon-Mobil, Chevron-Texaco, ConocoPhilips, and Halliburton, Cheney's old company. Other meetings between Chalabi and American oil companies took place in Europe, during which the former promised the latter exclusive oil deals in return for help in overthrowing Saddam. In December of 2002 and January of 2003, Cheney's staff met with INC cadres and DOS officials about the future of Iraqi oil. They discussed ways to restructure the Iraqi oil industry to allow American oil companies greater access through privatization. After the invasion, Chalabi became temporary oil minister. In September 2003, the Iraqi interim government allowed the all-important profit-sharing agreements in the oil sector, called PSAs. Resource channels were certainly not slow in forming under the new U.S. Imperium in Iraq. By coincidence, Republican Jack Kemp had dinner with Cheney in 2003 and later announced plans for a new company called Free Market Global to exploit Iraqi gas and oil. A board member of this new venture was General Tommy Franks, who led the invasion of Iraq. A company called SAIC was awarded a contract to build a pro-American media in Iraq. One of its directors was General Wayne Downing, a close advisor to Ahmed Chalabi. U.S. corporations gained a controlling share of all Iraqi construction contracts, especially anything related to oil. Most were friends of Bush II. Done in the name of freedom, this massive capital invasion was part of a managed attempt to bring American stability and control to Iraq. But to say that it was managed is not to conclude that it was an efficient process free of widespread mismanagement, looting, bribery, top-to-bottom corruption, sectarian terrorism, and political anarchy. This is your Empire historian, Frank H. Wallis, Ph.D. Thank you for listening and thinking.